this list, in our number 10 spot, we have the story of Carol Chase McElhenney. One day in 2006, Carol was driving through San Bernardino, California on her way to Paris, California, where she was going to stay for a few days. On her travels, she saw a sign for Riverside, which was nearby, and she decided that since her family had roots there, maybe it was time to stop in for a visit. As she went into Riverside, she realized that everything looked different from how she remembered it, and was unable to find her old house that she grew up in. She tried to go to the street that her grandmother used to live on, but that one was different too. And when she tried to visit her grandparents' graves at the cemetery, the whole place didn't even exist. Even the people who were living in the town gave Carol a bad feeling, and she didn't even want to get out of her car. She decided she would just be better off continuing on her trip and left Riverside. Carol didn't end up returning to Riverside until a few years later, after her dad had passed and she was attending the funeral. To Carol's surprise, when she went to Riverside this time, everything was as she remembered it from her childhood. Carol believes that day that she ended up in some sort of parallel universe form of Riverside, and she even said that she felt like if she left her car that day, she was going to get stuck there. In our number 9 spot, we have this story from Peru. The Marcohuesi forest in Peru has been called a doorway to another dimension for centuries because of all the stone figures that resemble human faces and religious figures, and because of the amount of people who go missing and never get found. There was a group of friends who decided to enter the forest despite all of these stories, and they ended up stumbling upon a cabin that appeared to have some sort of party going on inside. As the group went up to the cabin, they saw people inside, but all of the people were in 17th century garb, and nothing that was modern or similar to what the group of friends was wearing. One of the friends began to try and enter the cabin and was halfway in the door when the friends quickly pulled her back. After being pulled out, it was discovered that the half of her body that had entered the cabin was now paralyzed. If her body really did become paralyzed because it had entered another dimension, that would definitely explain all of those strange stone statues. In our number 8 spot, we have the old story of the Green Children of Woolpit. In the 12th century, it is said that 2 children were discovered just outside of Woolpit, Great Britain, but what was so weird about them is that they had green skin. When the children were brought back into the city and given food and water, they refused to eat anything other than raw beans. Eventually, their green skin began to fade and turned into a more normal human color. One of the children passed away, but the girl continued to grow and eventually learned English. When she was finally able to communicate with those around her, she told the story of how her and her brother had come from a place that was in constant darkness called St. Martin's Land. Everyone from her town lived underground, and everyone had the same green skin. The girl and her brother were wandering around one day when they came across a cave, and they decided to enter. They kept walking and eventually came to Woolpit, and when they turned around, the cave they had been in disappeared. Did this cave act as a portal to an alternate reality for these kids? If so, I don't ever want to end up where they come from because it does not sound nice. Guys, before I continue on in this list, make sure you hit that like button because it really helps us out. In our number 7 spot today, we have the story of James Richards. In 2009, James was walking his dog when he tripped and knocked his head, rendering him unconscious. When he woke up, he found himself beside some sort of machine he didn't recognize, and there was another man named Jonas who said he had just found James' body while he was on a work trip for the interdimensional travel company that he worked for. What? The two ended up striking up some sort of conversation, I guess like you would when someone just casually tells you that they travel through dimensions for work. They started chatting about what pop culture was like in each of their dimensions, and they came to discover that, of course, the Beatles existed in both of their dimensions. Jonas ended up explaining that in his dimension, the Beatles were all still alive and they had never actually broken up. Jonas gave James a cassette tape of the Beatles music from his dimension that certainly does not exist in ours. When James returned to our universe, he ended up uploading the tape to a website called thebeatlesneverbroakeup.com. In our number 6 spot, we have a story from Reddit that was posted by the user 2humfolk. One day, the writer was driving home from school and began trying to call their boyfriend using the hands-free feature. The phone didn't end up ringing even after 5 separate attempts, so they turned the phone off and then on again and tried one more time. This time the boyfriend answered, but it didn't really sound like the person they knew and loved, and they also sounded like they were pretty freaked out. He said, "Liz, is this you?" Liz kept saying hello, but wasn't getting an answer, and panicked and hung up the phone. Liz tried calling again twice, but there was no ring again. Luckily, on the 3rd try, another voice picked up the phone and asked, "Is this better?" Liz then asked who this was, and the voice responded with something unintelligible, and then they hung up. Liz continued to call the boyfriend until he picked up the phone. Sounding significantly more like himself and not panicked at all, Liz asked who was picking up the phone earlier, and the boyfriend explained that no one had picked up the phone because he had never received any other calls. When Liz got home and checked the boyfriend's call log, they realized that only one call had gone through to his phone. Liz made sure that they were dialing the right number when they were calling, and it was the correct number every single time. Who had been answering the boyfriend's phone? At our number 5 spot and halfway mark, we have another Reddit post from Tiger King Quentin. The user explains that this story takes place when they were 8 years old in Florida with their family and their friend's family for a 2-week vacation. The friend really wanted to go to Wet n Wild and begged for his parents to take them there, so they ended up going one day during the trip. The boy and his dad ended up going into the wave pool that day and were mainly staying in the shallow area. After a while, a larger wave comes their way and it takes the boy underneath the water. He realizes he can't feel the bottom anymore and begins to panic, trying to break the surface of the water. When he reaches the top and gets his head out of the water, he realizes that he is no longer at Wet n Wild, but is in the middle of an ocean a couple hundred meters from an island. He doesn't know where or what this island is, but after a few seconds he begins to feel lightheaded and sinks back into the water. Luckily, he then feels some hands under his arms and he realizes his dad is lifting him out of the water back at Wet n Wild, asking him if he's alright. Maybe this wave pool really did take this kid to an alternate dimension. In our number 4 spot, we have a story coming from Tokyo in 1954. At the Haneda airport, a plane from Europe landed and dropped off its passengers. As the passengers made their way through customs, one man told the officials that he was just on a normal business trip that he made regularly. He spoke French as his first language, but could also speak Japanese and a few other languages. Officials then asked him where he was from, and his response is where things take a turn. He said he was from a place called Torrid, which was on the border between France and Spain. When officials told him that the place didn't exist, he gave them a passport that had been issued by this country that isn't real. This passport had also been stamped, validating all of the previous trips he had said he went on, including his previous trips to Japan. Officials called the company that he said he was meeting with, and the company said that they had never heard of him or his company before. They then called the hotel he said he had a reservation at, and the bank that was listed on his checkbook. The hotel said that there was no reservation for him, and the bank just didn't exist at all. Officials thought that maybe he was confused, so they showed him a map and pointed to the country of Andorra, asking him if this is what he meant. The man began to get upset, saying that Andorra didn't exist and that it had misplaced Torrid, where he claimed to be from. Customs decided to detain the man and put him in a hotel room for the night while they decided what to do next. The next day, when they went to collect the man, he had totally disappeared with all of his personal identification and documents. Police searched for this missing man, but he was never found. Maybe this man somehow accidentally found himself in a parallel universe separate from his own, and I just hope he was able to make it back to wherever he was from and return to his normal life. In our number 3 spot, we have the story of a man named Jafar Vorin. Jafar was a strange man who just appeared in a village one day before he was picked up by authorities. The language he spoke was closest to German, but even then it wasn't quite the same. Jafar said he was from a place called Sakria and that he was searching for his brother who had been lost in a shipwreck. He couldn't point out where he was from, but was able to tell authorities some geographical information about where he had come from. He explained that his home had 5 separate compartments, or continents, called Sakria, Aflar, Aslar, and Uplar. He couldn't show anyone how he had arrived at the village, and he had no idea how to get home, so he just ended up living out the rest of his life in Berlin. It's crazy to think that maybe he was a man from another dimension and he ended up just getting stuck here. I feel bad for him, and I wish we could have helped him return home. In our number 2 spot, we have the story of Pedro Ramirez. Pedro was driving from a place called Seville to his home in Alcalá de Guadalajara on a November night in 1986. As he went around a curve in the road, he suddenly found himself on a 6-lane highway, and as he continued to drive straight, he saw tall buildings, unidentified structures, and grass that was 2 feet tall growing alongside the road. These were all things that were out of the ordinary for that area. He continued driving, and suddenly Pedro heard a voice that told him he had been transferred to another country in a different hemisphere. Pedro didn't know what to do, so he kept driving for another hour before stopping on the side of the road to take a look around. After a short break, he began driving again, only to come across a sign with 3 arrows pointing in different directions. One was labeled Malaga, the other was Sevilla, and the last was Alcabala. Pedro decided to take the Sevilla route, and after driving down it for a while, he stopped again. When he pulled over and got out of the car, he stood there for a second, and then when he looked back to his left, he saw he was standing right outside of his home. He tried to go back to where he had been before, but couldn't find anything that he had seen before, including the sign with the 3 arrows. Who knows where Pedro was for that while, but I'm very glad that he ended up making it home safely. In our number 1 spot today, we have the story of Lorena Garcia. One morning in 2008, Lorena woke up in a life that was similar to the one she was living when she went to sleep, but certainly not the same. At first, it was just small things like her bed sheets and her pajamas, but when she got to work, things began to escalate. Lorena realized that her office wasn't her office and that she worked in the same building, but in a completely different department. She had never even met her boss before, so she knew that this couldn't have been a moment where she just got lost or confused. When she returned home after work that day, she was met by her ex-boyfriend, only to find out that he was apparently her current boyfriend. She tried to find the person that she had been dating for months, but he didn't seem to exist in this new life and world that she found herself in. Lorena began to seek psychiatric help because she was fearing that she was having some sort of nervous breakdown, but all tests revealed that she seemed to be of sound body and mind. The strange occurrences continued when Lorena asked her family how her sister was doing. Lorena knew that her sister had recently had shoulder surgery and wanted to check in, but when she asked her family, they were baffled by her claims and insisted that there was no surgery that had taken place on anyone in the family. Lorena couldn't find any answers to her situation and was having no luck with a medical explanation either. She is convinced that she went to sleep one night and woke up in a parallel universe that was altered slightly by small decisions that she had made. Honestly, after all of these stories, I kind of believe Lorena too.
Starting off this countdown, we have the wrong turn. So this is a real story reported by 4 university students. Their names were never disclosed to protect their identity. But apparently in May of 1972, they were on their way back from a Utah rodeo and headed to their dorm. On their way back, they decided to take a shortcut. But that was their first mistake. While traveling along this unknown road, the path suddenly turned into gravel, and then all of a sudden they hit a dead end. So they had to travel all the way back down the road that they just came. However, while doing so, they noticed that the path had changed. It didn't look like the same original path that they originally took. All of a sudden, they saw something glowing in the distance. They drove towards it and found themselves at a weird building with a neon sign. The neon sign was in a language that none of them recognized. When they pulled towards the building for help, these weird tall men came out towards them. They seemed confused and angry. One got close to the car and one of the girls screamed. The tall man didn't appear to be human, so they sped out of there. While driving away, they saw weird egg-shaped vehicles following them. They sped until the vehicles stopped following them. Finally, they somehow reached the road that they were originally on. To this day, they believe that they somehow traveled to another universe through that road. Isn't that creepy? Hit that thumbs up button if you agree. In our 9th spot, we have the Lyft ride and the disappearing store. Just recently, Reddit user NoBookkeeper3991 decided to take a Lyft to go to the dollar store. It wasn't too far from his place, and it wasn't complicated to get to. A couple minutes go by and he should have reached the store by now, but they couldn't find it. The store just randomly wasn't there anymore. In fact, the whole street looked different. Both the dude and the Lyft driver started to panic. Everything changed in front of them in a flash. It was super weird. So yeah, the guy didn't end up going to the dollar store that day. Apparently, they rode into a parallel universe or something. And of course, days later, the missing dollar store magically reappeared again. Moving on, at number 8, we have the disappearing professor. A well-known faculty member at the University of the Andes disappeared on campus without a trace. According to multiple witnesses, they saw the professor leave one of the university's buildings, cross the parking lot, and get into his car. Many people saw this happen. In fact, people were calling at him and waving to him as he got into his car. But his car sat there unmoving for a while. A couple of students actually approached the car to see what was going on and found the car empty. The professor was nowhere to be found. To this day, the professor has never returned. It's assumed that when he got into his car, he was transported to a different universe. Moving on, at number 7, we have the Green Children of Woolpit. Back in the 13th century, 2 weird children randomly appeared in the village of Woolpit in England. The 2 were brother and sister and had weird greenish colored skin. To make things weirder, they spoke a language no one heard of, and they were dressed in weird clothing. They also didn't want to eat anything except raw beans. Eventually, they were taken in, but sadly, the boy became sick and passed away. The girl, on the other hand, started to like normal food and started to lose the green color in her skin. After learning to speak English, she said that her and her brother were from a place where people had green skin and the sun didn't shine bright. They were herding their dad's cattle when all of a sudden they heard a loud noise. Bam! They were in a new place. Now the girl ended up growing up and marrying a man and starting a whole new life there. But it seems like the 2 traveled there from another dimension. Coming in at number 6, we have the campsite. A couple of years ago, a woman and her friends were out camping when they heard music coming from the forest. They followed the sound thinking that they were alone and came across a small stone cabin. The weirdest part? When they approached the cabin, they saw people dressed in 17th century fashion. One of the friends was fascinated and went over to the cabin to try and go inside. As she was about to enter, one of her friends pulled her away. As that happened, half of her body became paralyzed, the half that entered the cabin. It's believed that she partially entered another dimension, and that threw off her nervous system, which resulted in half of her body becoming paralyzed. We're now at our 5th and halfway mark with the deaths. This story is pretty intense, so buckle your seatbelts. But basically, one night this woman had a dream about someone she knew dying. 3 days later, that dream came true and the person passed away. This has happened to her a number of times. She falls asleep, has a dream that someone dies, and in exactly 3 days, that dream comes true and that person passes away. I mean, that sounds like a horror movie plot, like if you agree. Anyways, this has happened to 2 of her colleagues, 3 of her grandparents, her great-grandfather, her friend's grandfather, 2 school teachers, 3 of her friends, and a random lady she met for 5 minutes one day at work. So maybe don't become friends with her, because then she'll have a dream about you and then you'll die. I'm just kidding. But some people believe that she's actually hopping from different universes. In one universe, the person has already passed away. When she jumps back to her current universe, the person isn't dead yet. And that's what triggers these dreams. They're just memories from other universes that she has traveled to. In our 4th spot, we have the different family home. Back in the day, a woman named Carol Chase McElhenney decided to visit her old family town and area. But when she was driving down her old street, she couldn't find the old house that she grew up in. In fact, all the houses on the street looked completely different. She then decided to drive to the street where her grandmother used to live on. But when she got there, she found that the street was completely different as well. She then was driving through the town, noticing that almost everything was changed. Like the cemetery where her parents were buried wasn't there anymore. Or a strip of restaurants and hotels was now just a graffiti-covered area. She started feeling very uncomfortable and drove off. A few years later, Carol's father died and they went back to the cemetery to bury him with his parents. Surprisingly, the cemetery magically reappeared and everything about the town was back to normal. So she believes that during her other trip, she managed to visit her old town from a different dimension. In our third spot, we have the birth certificate. Just recently, Reddit user Professional Echo 348 went to get a new birth certificate. They were at town hall when they saw that their mother's middle name was not right. It was written as Victoria, but her real middle name was Virginia. So she asked the clerk what was up with it. Even her last birth certificate had her mom's middle name as Virginia. Sadly, her mom passed away 17 years ago, so she couldn't just phone up her mom and ask her what was up. Plus, she even named her daughter's middle name after her mom's middle name. So she decided to dig into this some more. She was going through old files when she saw that her mother was once married to a man named Pierce, which again was wrong. His name was actually Pierre, not Pierce. So sometime in her life, she switched universes. One where her mother's middle name was Victoria and her stepfather's name was Pierce. Coming in at number 2, we have the different girlfriend. One day, a guy woke up only to find that he had been sleeping next to some random girl. He freaked out, and the girl, whose name was Laura, was all like, WTF, we've been dating for a couple of years now. How don't you remember? Stop fooling around, this isn't funny. Sure enough, his apartment was filled with framed photos of them together. What's weird is that wasn't his girlfriend. He was dating a girl named Maria, not Laura. So apparently, he went to bed with Maria and woke up beside a new girlfriend, Laura. So somehow he managed to switch universes in his sleep. That is insane. And does that count as cheating? Let me know in the comments below. And in our number 1 spot, we have Lorena Garcia. Lorena Garcia lived a pretty mundane life until one day, everything changed forever. Her life literally got flipped upside down. So she woke up one day and noticed her bed sheets were different than normal. She kind of just ignored it and went on with her day. But as she made her way to work, she noticed little things were off. Again, she ignored it as she arrived at work. But when she got to her department, she realized it wasn't her department. She thought that she was on the wrong floor, but she wasn't. She had worked there for the last 20 years. But today, she worked in a different department. She even looked herself up on her work's database. She worked at the same company, but it said she worked at a different department. Then things continued to get weird. Her former boyfriend disappeared without a trace. There was no sign of him anywhere. There was not even a sign that the two had even dated. In fact, she hired someone to see what happened to him. Turns out, he never existed. At least not in this universe. Her current boyfriend was someone completely different. So somehow, when Lorena went to bed, she managed to travel to another universe. Isn't that crazy? Like, imagine waking up and having a completely new job and partner. I would freak out and probably go insane. Starting off this countdown, we have the parallel wedding. This story was posted on Reddit by the user Parallel Alt Girl, who went to a wedding in a parallel universe. So back in the day, she attended her aunt's wedding. The wedding was big and the theme of the wedding was dark blue. So all the bridesmaids were wearing blue dresses, and so was she. After the wedding, she took a little nap before the reception. But when she woke up, she was no longer in a blue dress. She was in a light orange one. So was everyone else. She didn't know how that was even possible. But even looking back at the wedding photos, she was photographed attending the wedding in an orange dress, along with all the other bridesmaids. So now she believes that she somehow woke up in another universe, one where everyone wore orange instead of blue to the wedding. In our 9th spot, we have the swapped selves. This story was posted on Reddit by the user someoneelse777. She believes that she swapped places with her parallel universe self. So story goes that she was out for a hike one day with her boyfriend. They were nearing the end of the hike when her boyfriend decided to climb a big rock formation. But she was too tired, so she continued to walk down the path to meet him at the other end. However, while walking, she got a bad feeling, thinking that something bad happened to her boyfriend. Then all of a sudden, she was someone else. She went from thinking, what if my boyfriend gets hurt? I should rescue him, to, I came here alone, who am I rescuing? So in one universe, she was out hiking with her boyfriend. In the other, she was out hiking alone. When she switched places, she noticed that her other self was a bit different. She was a bit taller, fitter, and felt more confident. She was also carrying a tent and supplies for a solo journey. Her boyfriend was not with her. Like what? That would freak me out. Just all of a sudden like, and you're someone else? But like, yourself, but then someone else? I don't know. Coming in at number 8, we have the castle. Posted on Reddit by the user John30859, he shared his experience visiting a parallel universe. But this one was actually quite magical. So story goes that John and his cousin were outside on the porch when 2 teenagers approached them and asked them if they wanted to see a castle. I mean, that has stranger danger written all over it. But the 2 boys were young and naive, so they followed them along a path in the woods. Little while later, they saw a huge, beautiful castle in the distance. They got so excited that they ran home to show their parents. But when they arrived home, his mom got mad and told them to stay inside for the rest of the night. Here's the thing, he claims that his mom is very strict. She's always checking in on them when they're playing outside, so she would have noticed if they left. On top of that, in the area he lives in, there are no castles or churches or anything else that could have been mistaken for a castle. But the boys both vividly remember seeing the castle, even now at 25 years old. So what happened? Well, other people replied to his post offering him 2 explanations. One is that they were taken to Fairy, basically a parallel dimension that can only be reached by doors in hills, under lakes and wells, through hedges, etc. The next is that the teenagers were actually aliens in disguise that brought them into another dimension. Either way, they somehow got transported into a world that has a giant castle. Moving on at number 7, we have the 3rd floor. This next story was posted on Reddit by the user FeiFei775. Back in 2015, he went to the hospital to visit his dad, who was a patient there. After spending some time with him, he left with his friend to go get some snacks. So they hopped on the elevator and went to the 3rd floor where all the food was. But when the doors opened, they found that the whole area was completely deserted. The lights were flickering and the floor was trashed. Scared, they headed on back to the 5th floor where his dad's room was. Fast forward to a week later, they are back at the hospital. And turns out that his dad was, and had always been, on the 3rd floor, which was now cleaned up and in use. So he is convinced that he somehow took an elevator to a different universe. Coming in at number 6, we have jumping universes. So this story was posted on Reddit a month ago, but the user that posted the story deleted their account. I wonder why. Maybe they ended up in a different universe. Alright, so this individual wrote that every time they wake up from a sleep, they believe that they are in a different universe. The differences in each universe are small, but still you know that something is not quite right. Some people will act differently from day to day, or a location of objects will move ever so slightly. So they believe that every day they end up in a different universe. And a lot of people commented on this post claiming that they too have had similar experiences, where they fall asleep and then wake up and they're in a different universe. My only question is, how many universes are out there? We are now at our 5th and halfway mark with the accident. Posted by the user UMAwake, they shared a story about the time that they were involved in an accident in one universe but not the other. So when she was younger, she was outside watching her uncle do wheelies on his 4-wheeler. Eventually she hopped on to have some fun, but sadly the 4-wheeler flipped. All she remembers is it getting very quiet and then waking up on the couch inside the house. She went outside to find her family helping her cousin and uncle get out from under the 4-wheeler, but she vividly remembers being the one on the vehicle that flipped. Coming in at number 4, we have the breakfast place. Posted on Reddit by the user TexasKSMO, she shares a story about the time her and her husband visited a restaurant in a parallel universe. So to begin, the couple bought a little country house which they go to on the weekends. One weekend while traveling there, they decided to stop and have breakfast at a restaurant they had never seen before. They entered and a man in a cowboy hat said, "You can just seat yourself." I feel like that's what he sounded like if he had a cowboy hat on, so. They ended up having a nice meal and wanted to return a couple weeks later. However, when they went back to try and find the same restaurant, it was gone. Instead, in place of the restaurant was an old boarded up abandoned building. The building looked the same, but was completely deserted. Dun, dun, dun. I wonder how food tastes though in another universe. Maybe it's better, maybe it's worse. Maybe they have new food that we don't have in this universe. Who knows? In our third spot, we have the workday. This story was posted 4 years ago on Reddit, but sadly the account is now deleted, so I can't give them credit. So according to this post, it was September 11th, 2015, and the guy was headed to his job of 5 years. But when he got there, he said that something fell off. In fact, he saw employees that he had never even seen before. He ended up striking a conversation with one of them and mentioned how it was September 11th and how it was sad what happened on that day. But the employee had no clue what he was talking about. The guy explained it, but the employee was all like, "What attacks? That never happened." Then on his way home, he was listening to the radio and it mentioned Howard Dean as president. Obviously, this freaked the guy out, so as soon as he got home, he decided to just lay down and relax. He ended up falling asleep, and when he woke up, he was back in his normal universe. Honestly, I think it would be super scary to get trapped in a universe that isn't yours. Like, you'd be telling stories and people would be like, "What are you talking about, you little crazy person?" Like, no one would believe you. You'd be by yourself. Sad. Coming in at number 2, we have The Assignment. 3acid Nirvana on Reddit shared his experience about traveling to another universe, where something freaky happened to him at school. So in one of his courses, his teacher gave the class a massive research assignment. For the assignment, they had to use resources from a list the teacher supplied them with. So he ended up using this one book in the library to help him write the paper. About a week before the paper was due, he needed to go cite something from the book, but he already returned it to the library. So he went to the library and asked to get the book. Not only did the library not carry the book, but there was no such book ever written. Which is freaky, because how could he write a whole paper on a topic that he didn't know without any sources? So he must have traveled to a different universe, one where that book doesn't exist. And in our number 1 spot, we have Denny's. Ever wonder what food is like in an alternate universe? Well, they still got Denny's, I can tell you that. But it goes by another name there, Penny's. Yep. Reddit user is_emo posted a story about the time he ended up going to a place called Penny's, which was identical to Denny's. From the building to the food and the menu, everything was the same. Except it was called Penny's. He even asked his parents about it since he had been to that restaurant in that same location multiple times, but they said it has always been called Penny's. A couple weeks later, when passing by the restaurant, he noticed the sign "Turn back to Denny's." He asked his parents again and they said they have never even heard about Penny's. What's going on? Like, that would drive me insane. Does this happen to other restaurants too in other dimensions? Like, is Chick-fil-A called Flick-Chile? Thought-provoking question.